All right, so back again, here to talk with you a little bit after going through the discussion for Module 2 this time, looking specifically at the issues of narrative, right? And how does narrative fit into Catholic morality and into our understanding of how we pursue happiness as Christians? There was lots of good discussion. I think you all brought up a number of good points. I was really struck. Um, by how this discussion of narrative really elicited a lot of your personal stories. And I think a lot of those posts very obviously had kind of a more meaningful impact on your fellow students in the discussion. So I think just the fact of talking about stories, which elicited people's own stories, kind of illustrated the power, right, of using narrative as a means of engaging about important issues. So I think that was nicely done, and I appreciate those of you who are willing to share kind of your own stories, even when they were sometimes about very challenging parts of life. So I appreciate that. There were just a couple of things. There wasn't really a whole lot of disagreement in the discussion, which I think was good. I think there was some consensus. There were just a couple of things I wanted to take a moment to talk about in a little more detail than I was able to in sort of the written feedback on the posts. Because there were a couple of things that stood out, right? One was, again, some people expressing concerns about the gray areas, right, that come up around a narrative approach to ethics, right, which is often raised as one of the possible problems with it. And I do think it's worth recognizing that, right, that if people's stories, if people's narrative of how the world works is going to lead them to different conclusions about morality, then that does seem to open the door for some variation to the point where you end up sort of a moral relativism, right? There is a danger of that. But I do think it's worth recognizing um, that essentially every ethical system is going to have danger when it comes to applying it to specific situations, right? And so one of the things that we will talk about as we go along and talk more about like traditional natural law theory or Catholic morality, right, is that there are certain principles that follow from natural law and that the Catholic Church would say we ought to hold. But in terms of figuring out how to apply them to specific situations, there's a whole field referred to as prudential judgment, right? So that we can say we never intentionally harm an innocent human being. In the healthcare field, we never intentionally harm or kill. Um, but there are certain procedures we do that are going to entail some physical harms as a side effect. There are certain procedures that run certain risks of even death. Um, so, how do we engage in those procedures while still affirming this basic principle? And so, there's going to be cases where there is a lot of ambiguity in terms of how the different principles apply to a specific situation. Is this a situation where we can legitimately risk um, the death of a patient because of the nature of what we're doing and because of the good that's being sought, right? And those kinds of complicated questions, which open up all kinds of potential for ambiguity, are going to be a factor again in any pretty much ethical system. So that is not a danger that is unique to sort of a narrative approach to ethics. And I think that's worth recognizing, not to say that it's not an issue, but to say it's not an issue unique to this more narrative approach. And kind of following up on that, one of the things to think about, right? And I would suggest that actually the two approaches, as I think I said in the module, can in many ways be complementary, right? And that it can be more of a question of emphasis than a question of complete disagreement, right? That when we think about natural law, right, in a very traditional sense, right, what we do in natural law is we can assess each moral act, right? So we're going to take a moral act, uh, and assess it. There are going to be sort of three standard criteria we use to determine whether this act is right or wrong, good or bad. And those components are known as the object, which is a little confusingly It's like the object being considered, so the specific act, right? So the act as intended is the object of a moral act. So, um, robbing a bank, right? That would be an object. That's a moral act. Or helping an old lady across the road, right? That's a uh, an object, right? So one of the things to be clear, and we'll talk about this more as we go along, is that when we're thinking about the object of a moral act in natural law, it's specifically the act as intended. So, for example, you can't just use cutting off an arm as you need to explain more about how this act is intended, right? So, cutting off an infected arm in surgery to save a patient's life is a different moral act, it's a different object than cutting off the arm of your victim in a torture kidnapping scenario where you are um, intentionally harming this person for your own enjoyment, right? That those cutting off an arm happens in both acts, but they are different acts because they are acts that are intended differently. And we could talk more about that. But so you have the act as intended. That's sort of the key component of it, determining whether or not an act is moral or immoral. But it's not the only component, right? That we also have to look at intentions and circumstances. So when we're looking at an action, uh, we think, okay, this is the action to be done, robbing a bank. But if a person is robbing a bank in order to get the money to save a bunch of starving children, that may not make robbing the bank moral, but it certainly is going to shape our overall moral judgments, right? It certainly has a bearing on how we assess this action and the person performing it. In other cases, you could say um, the intention might actually make something which was otherwise seem moral immoral, right? That a person making a huge donation to a hospital, um, that's a generally a good thing. But if they're doing it in order to impress someone who they're trying to seduce into an adulterous affair, that would be bad, right? So that otherwise good thing, if done for that bad intention, actually makes the act wrong in that specific situation, given what their intention is in performing the act. So another way of looking at it is you need to know the next steps of the story, if you will, in order to offer a full moral analysis, right? So you need to be able to look forward to why is this being done, which is another way of talking about the story or the narrative of this person and their actions. And also, you need to assess the circumstances, right? And so that's sort of telling us what led to this point or the context of this action, right? So that, if you are performing an action in some circumstances, it might be good, and in others, the same action might be immoral, right? So, donating money to restore a nice painting in an old church may be a perfectly good and moral thing to do. But if you're doing that as members of that church community are literally starving to death in the pews because they don't have enough money to eat, that would make that action then immoral, right? Because you are pursuing um, what would otherwise be a good thing in a circumstance where there are much more important things to be done, right? So we need to know the circumstances, or another way of putting it, we need to know the bigger story, right? And so when we talk about the importance of narrative and moral judgment, I think in many ways this actually parallels what you see in natural law theory because you have to know the intention and you have to know the circumstances of an act in order to offer an overall assessment of it. In other words, the story. So I just wanted to go ahead and introduce those components of natural law theory to you so that um, we can start getting familiar with it, and also to show, while that there are some definite debates about how we should phrase things, how we should emphasize things, and there are some substantive differences between these different approaches to Catholic ethics. I think it's important to recognize there is actually room for a lot of agreement in um, how we actually live out a moral life, within these different approaches and these different frameworks. So again, thank you for some good discussion, and I look forward to continuing it in our next module.